like visual component in here is made with Shadergraph. So if I select at first on this checkerboard pattern that we have for the sort of start of where the race is, you can see that we have this checker shader applied to it. And this has been created using Shadergraph. So we can open it up and have a look by selecting the little gear icon here and saying Edit Shader. And that's going to open a new window which has Shadergraph. And like I said, at first this can be a little bit daunting. There's all these spaghetti lines everywhere and all these nodes and all these pictures. So that's why I think it'd be a really cool idea to just start at the basics and make a cool little shader for the arrows on the track. So I'm going to go to my arrows. And at the moment, they have this blinking arrow shader on, and that's fine, but it's not very exciting. It'd be cool if it was moving and we can direct the player around the track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, and now we can create a shader. And there's a selection of graphs. So we can do an unlit shader, or we can do a PBR shader, but we can also do subgraphs. And I'm going to show you how to create those and how they're super useful a little bit later. So we're going to do a physically based rendering graph today. I'm going to select that. And let's call it Unite India Arrows. If I spelled that correctly, yeah. There we go. It's the same symbol as if you've written shaders in Unity before. It's this multicolor with an S, so it's exactly the same. And we can double click to open it. Oh, is it crashed? That's useful. This one. Now you've seen the sneak preview of the more complex examples that was meant to come later. Let's try that again. Oops. Here we go. Oh, no, I don't want package manager. So let's get back to that again. Let's create a shader. Night India arrows. Okay. Yeah, I know you quit unexpectedly. Back to the environment and the track and those arrows. Back in. Are you going to crash again? No, there we go. Hey. So, Shadergraph, when you open it, when you create a new one, is made up of 3 components. So the first one is this master node. So the master node is going to be different depending on whether you've done a subgraph, a PBR graph, or an unlit one. But each of the attributes, if you've made materials in Unity before, is really familiar. So we have the albedo, the color without lighting information, we have the normals, you can change the metallic and smoothness, and all the changes that you make, all the nodes that you add, all of the finished final product is going to be shown in this master node. So this is where all of your efforts come down to this singular node of how it finally looks. This little window at the bottom is the preview node. So you can take your mouse and you can drag the shape around. If there's a particular model that you're working on for the shader, you can actually just bring in a custom mesh and you can preview that in this window too. And the final is this blackboard. And what we use the blackboard for is if you have any values that you want to expose to the editor. And we're going to do this a little later, so it should make a little bit more sense there too. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a node to add some color to get started. So we can right-click and we can create a node. And there is a vast amount of nodes. You can put in logic and do maths. You can add colors, you can add textures. There's a lot here. And you can use the search bar to get what you're after. So if we have color. You can also right-click and open the documentation. So if there's a node that you don't really know what it does, you can just right-click on it, go to the documentation straight from there. So I'm just going to make this red. It's my favorite color. And then each node has this output branch. And we can just take the mouse, click on the output, and drag it. So I'm going to plug this into the albedo and the emission. And we can see that as I do this, the master node updates. We can also select this little settings icon here. And we can change this shader to have a transparency. And we can knock down the alpha. And all of this updates in that master node. To make sure that any of your changes show in editor, click the Save Asset button. And then what I'm going to do is just dock this at the bottom here. Oops, if it'll let me. There we go. So the way that we actually apply this in editor is we select the object that we want to add the shader to. And then we can select it from the shader dropdown. But if everything in your scene, like this one, has everything made with Shadergraph, it can get a little bit crazy. So what you can actually do is under the name of your shader in the blackboard, you can double click underneath and you can create a file path. So I can write Unite India /arrows, save this asset, pop back over, find that in my graph. There we go. And it applies straight away. Now, any changes that we make when we save the asset, we're going to see it pop in the editor straight away. I'm going to save it just in case it decides to misbehave again. So the next thing that I'm going to do is add a texture. So again, I can right-click to create a node. I can search for texture, and you can see that there's quite a lot of different textures. You can add normal maps here. You can also use RMA maps, so for your roughness, metallic, and AO, and you can split those off. So in fact, I'll show you that later. It makes more sense to show you. So I'm going to use sample texture 2D. I'm going to select the arrow texture. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a multiply node. And what the multiply node does is it takes in two inputs and it gives you the output of those two values multiplied. So I can take the color and I can take my texture and multiply them together and use this to plug into the master node. You can also delete existing joins by selecting an object, right-click, and deleting it. You can select them and move them, and you can also use the Alt key to pan around as well. So I'm going to plug this into the albedo and the emission. I'm going to save this, and we can see that straight away it updates in the editor. So it's looking a little bit better already. You can also kind of experiment a lot as well because you get that instant visual feedback. So if I want to take one channel and plug it into another, so I can take the red channel of the texture and plug it into the alpha. What does that look like? Looks a little bit better, I'll stick with that. You get that instant visual feedback in the editor and in the master node. And say that we're creating this and we want to distribute it to the team and have other people using it. We can then expose these values in the editor, so people who don't want to touch this shader graph don't have to. And we can use that, we can do that with the blackboard. So what I'm going to do is go into the blackboard here and click on the plus icon, and you can see that there's lots of values we can expose to the editor. We've got textures, colors, and we can even add cube maps. So I'm going to have a color node, and I'm going to call this arrow color. And I'm going to keep the checkboxes exposed so that it shows in the editor. And I'm going to give it a default color just to get started. Then we can just select the name and drag it straight into the shader graph. We can delete this node. And we can plug that straight in. I'm going to save it again. And now when I return to the editor with the arrows selected, we can see that we can now change this color in the editor and that this arrow color has been exposed. So it can be really powerful and really useful to kind of help that across working across teams. So now we're going to make it scroll. So there's lots of different ways that you can do this. I guess that's the beauty of it, and there's lots of different ways you can do the same thing in a shader. But what I like to do is, there's actually a time node, and there's just time, there's delta time, and then there's also the sine wave, so you can create some cool effects with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the time, and I'm going to add another value to the blackboard of a vector 2, so just 2 float values. And I want this to be the direction in which my arrow scrolls. So one for the x-axis and one for the y. So I'm just going to call this like arrow scrolls value. And I'm going to give the default value of the x-axis a 1. So it's going to scroll constantly on the x-axis. I'm going to drag this in. And I'm going to use my multiply node again. I must admit, I use that a lot. It's probably my favorite. There's one thing to mention as well. There's a great blog post on if you want to create your own nodes. So for example, someone in our team wanted to multiply 4 values together, so we made a many multiply node. So if there are any programmers who are like, I want to do more with this graph, you can do that, and it's on our blog site. So now I am multiplying time with this 2 float value, this vector 2. And lucky for us in wanting to scroll this texture, there's actually a tiling and offset node. How very helpful. And we can just plug the output of this multiplication, of this movement across an axis over time. We can just plug that into the offset of this node, and then plug this into the UV for the texture, and it scrolls. What fun. So then we can see straight away in the editor, we have it scrolling, which is always good fun. Some more uses of this then is we can create subgraphs. So say that we like this very sort of simple few nodes of creating this scroll. What we can do is we can select all of the nodes involved in that operation. We can right click and we can convert it to a subgraph. You can also see here that you can generate the code as well. Like I said earlier, you can either generate the code of just a certain selection of nodes, or you can do this on the master node and generate the whole shader. But what we're going to do is convert it to a subgraph. So let's call this Unite India scroll graph. Oh, it's a subgraph. And save that. Then what it does is it actually saves it as a single node with any of the inputs or outputs that are needed to create that effect. So if we go back to that checkerboard at the beginning and think, maybe that would be a little bit more visually impactful if that also scrolled, we can select that. We can click on the little icon again to edit the shader. And then what we can do is we can select this top node and input that. And that's our little subgraph. Pop in that default value of x, and then we can plug this into our, which one is it? The offset node here. Ooh. Have I plugged that into the right one? Oh no, I've made a cool effect though. I think it's up here. Boop. It's this offset node. No, it's not working today. Oh well. But I guess this is the cool thing about Shadergraph, right? If you have something that you want to try out, you can do it straight away and iterate on it quite quickly. Haha. So like I said earlier, if you have a texture that you want to kind of reuse, so these rocks, for example, the rock shaders here. Let's open them. They actually take in this sample texture 2D, and then they split out each of the channels. So you can take in an RMA texture that has your roughness, your metallic, and your ambient occlusion, and you can split out those channels and plug them into your master node, and even do some multiplications during that transition, so you can get the visual effect that you're really after. Recently as well, as of Unity 2018.2, we introduced the idea of vertex manipulation as well. So if I select this bush here, where is it? This one, this guy. It's not going very well today. Oh no, what's going on? There we go. And edit that shader. From 2018-2, there's this, in the master node, there's something called the position node. And so at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you a link to a whole sample library of shaders that you can use to get started, and it has an example of this. So this is, there we go. So this whole kind of chunk of code here is using the time and the sine wave to be able to manipulate the position on the X and Y. So now we can see, I don't know if you can see it on the projector, but now we can see that it kind of looks like the bushes are blowing in the wind. So that's one of the example shaders that I'll show you. So like super quickly, you can get some instant visual feedback of what you're creating and quickly put it into the Unity editor. And there's a lot of different use cases for it, which is cool. Like I said, there's a lot to take in with what is available. And if you've written shaders before, I can guarantee that if you've got a function in mind that you'd like to use, like clamping the normals or that kind of thing, there will be a node for it in here. It's just a matter of like popping to the documentation. So just in the last couple of minutes, I want to show some of the examples of what it could be used for, just some like fun examples. And just a little tip as well, in case it was something that you didn't know. But if you've got an effect on your shader and it doesn't seem to be showing in the editor, chances are you probably don't have the animated materials checkbox selected. You need to have that enabled for you to have any sort of visual feedback on your shaders, if they're like moving or that kind of thing. So this orb, this sphere, is very similar to what we just did in making the arrow, plugging in the colors and the emission and that kind of thing. So what it's actually doing is it's lerping between, let me get that, the shader. It's lerping between the colors, and it's lerping between them over time. So it's using this time node to lerp between these two colors and popping that into the albedo. And there's actually some addition and division going on here to be able to clamp those two values so it can only move within certain ranges. And again, this is just one way to be able to do that kind of thing. There is a clamp node as well, if you would prefer using that kind of system. But some of the guys and girls in the office like to get their maths brains on and use all of the arithmetic nodes. So it's whatever your preference is, really. The next example, and the one that's kind of my favorite, is the muddy dog. So the dog, is he on the master dog? Yeah, here we go. So the dog has got some textures exposed in the editor, as we saw before, just using a sample texture 2D. But what it's also got is this mud level. And if we slide this, we can see that the dog gets muddier or cleaner, depending on where we slide. And what this is doing is it's, again, kind of blending between two images. I'll show you. So we've got the normal map plugged in to the normal, so you can add your normals and your specular. And then what we're doing is we're lerping between the color value, and we're doing a multiplication of this black and white like splat map with the mud level, which we exposed in the editor. And so it's, again, there's a lot of cool ways to do different things. I just think this is a really nice example of what you can do. The final example is, so if any of you, for those of you that have used written shaders before and may be used to getting references of objects in your shader code, this is an example of that. So if I select this key, as we move it towards the lock, the closer we get, the lock glows. And what we've done here is, edit the shader. Is we have the texture for the chest, but we also have this overlying texture for the lock, which we can plug into the emission. But the thing that's making it decide how much to glow, it depends on how close the key is to the lock. So we need to get a reference to the key's like local space. So what you can do is use the blackboard to create an attribute, a property, but not have it exposed in the editor, but give it a reference. So we've got this underscore key position. Then what we can do is we can reference that in script. So again, if you've written shaders in Unity before, not much has changed. You're kind of getting the key position you're getting the key's transform position and then transferring it into this key position variable which Shadergraph is using. So there's quite a lot of power in that. So just to summarize, so Shadergraph is a node-based shader creation tool. To use it, when you get hold of it, which you can do from Package Manager, it's going to need either the lightweight render pipeline or the high-definition render pipeline to work. It's unfortunately not supported by the built-in pipeline. And as I said, it's available via the Package Manager. The GitHub link that you see here, the Shadergraph example library, is amazing, and it has a selection of different shaders that you can use to get started, starting from a simple scrolling texture like we looked at today, going to like holographic effects, there's like heat maps, and then very recently also the addition of like vertex offset, like there's a swimming fish example and that kind of stuff. So yes, thank you very much, and I hope that was useful.
All right. Thank you so much to Liz.
No problem.
On her run through of the shader graph. Here's just a little
Oh, thank you very much.
souvenir from the organizers.
Oh, that's really sweet.